That reminds me, I better put mine on silent too. All right, so tonight we're going to continue our series on a lifetime of service, and in the class that I'm doing tonight, and when Dan and I were laying out the lessons, you normally think of 13 Sundays in a quarter. Well, that wasn't the case this time. Of course, the first Sunday of the month, Dan and I were out of town. James extended his class one more week into this quarter, so that was one class lost. And then we had our gospel meeting. That was another Sunday lost. And then we got a fifth Sunday coming up, and it's the singing, I believe. And so that's the third class lost. So we're dividing this class up in half. And I sort of feel bad because tonight my class is on Jesus, a lifetime of service, and I feel bad he gets half a class. And then Dan's going to follow up with the Apostle John and when I get done. And if I don't get started, then he won't have time. So but Jesus, he's got the title of the series. It's Jesus, a Lifetime of Service. And as we've done a few times, which of the books of the Bible would you find the name Jesus?
Every book in the New Testament.
Find him in the Old Testament? Not by name.
Not by name.
But everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus, points to the Messiah that was coming. Jesus does not appear in all 27 New Testament books. There's one book he is not listed by name.
Jude.
Nope, not Jude. Not Philemon. 3 John is correct. He's not mentioned in 3 John. I mentioned in the class on Moses a few weeks ago, I told you that I thought Moses might have been the most frequently mentioned name in the Bible, and I told you at that time, and that's incorrect. Jesus is mentioned more in the Bible, even though he's only shows up in the New Testament. Moses shows up in the Old Testament and the New Testament, interspersed throughout all the books. But Jesus is mentioned more often, and rightly so, because his name is above all names. All right, in lifetime of service, society in Jesus' day was built upon the haves and the have-nots. And if you had wealth or you had power, you would live a relatively comfortable life. If you didn't have neither money nor power, you basically lived day to day, just hoping that you would have enough to make it through the day with food and shelter and the basic necessities of life. Jesus did not have wealth. You may recall that when he was confronted with paying the temple tax, he got the money to pay for it out of the mouth of a fish. Now, I know Timmy's not in here, but Matt, you're here. Have you ever got a coin or a dollar out of the mouth of a fish? Still trying. You probably have put a lot of money into fishing, but you're not likely to pull money out of a fish. And so, but Jesus did that. And Jesus didn't own a house. Matthew 8:20 says, and Jesus said to them, foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. In Luke 8, verses 1 through 3, it records that he was provided some financial support by some of the women that was in his entourage, if you would, that traveled around with Jesus and the disciples. Also, there were probably a few others that also helped provide support for him in his ministry. We do know that there was enough money that they had to have one of the disciples keep hold of the money. And for some reason, Judas was the one that was the money keeper. Was he a good money keeper?
No, it says he stole from him.
Yeah, he was described as a thief. The only person he was a good money keeper for was for Judas himself. And So he wasn't an honest individual. From a worldly sense, Jesus was a have-not, not a have. And as such, he could relate to the poor, to the sick, to the downtrodden. This is one reason why he was able to be to attract such large audiences as he went around preaching and teaching. The compassion that he had for those that were less fortunate can be seen in the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. He looked at them and saw that they were hungry, and he was able to feed them. And that's just one of the examples that comes to mind. Because Jesus spoke of a coming kingdom, many of his disciples thought that Jesus was speaking of him raising a military army to overthrow the Roman oppressors. Jesus had a following, and the disciples thought it just might be possible that Jesus could pull off an insurrection and establish an earthly kingdom. And the disciples sought to cement their place in this earthly kingdom. They thought it was time for them to start finding their spots. And James and his brother John were the first two to begin jockeying for position in what they thought would be an earthly kingdom. They requested to be seated at the right hand and the left hand side of Jesus. And while James and John were the first two to make this request, they weren't the only ones looking for prominent positions. Mark 10:41 says, when the other 10 disciples heard the request of James and John, they began to be indignant. They weren't indignant at the request James and John made. They were indignant because they weren't ahead of them. They didn't think of it first. They didn't speak up first. And so they were upset that someone had the gall to go to Jesus before they did. And then in Mark chapter 10, 42 through 44, Jesus responds to their request for prominent positions that probably took the disciples by surprise. Mark 10, 42 through 44. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. There's a lot packed into these 3 verses. Serving others is the basis for the life of Jesus in his short time on earth, and is one that we should follow as well. And having come to Jesus requesting positions of prominence in his kingdom, the disciples recognized, and you can give them credit for this, they recognized Jesus as being the head. They weren't saying, we want to be the leader. They wanted Jesus to be the leader. They just wanted to be close on his coattails. In the Gentile world and the Jewish world too, rulers and leaders were served by those below them, not the other way around. And it's pretty much the same way today too. Those that are in high positions, they want to be served. And sometimes they forget about serving those that make them what they are. And Jesus said, whoever is great among you must be your servant. In this conversation between Jesus and his disciples, who was the greatest in the group? Jesus. Jesus was the greatest. The disciples did not question that, but it must have thrown them for a loop when he said the greatest should be the servant. Jesus went on to say that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And he continues saying, and to give his life a ransom for many. Now, we're going to return to that thought about giving his life a ransom for many a little later in this segment. But what are some examples that show Jesus serving the poor, the sick, and the downtrodden? Where do you see Jesus doing this? The lepers.
He healed all who came to him.
Yeah, healed the people that came to him. The demon-possessed men, the feeding of the 5,000 that we talked with earlier. Yeah, and we're going to get to Jairus in just a sec. He also welcomed the children come to him. And children were a neglected part of society back then.
Even when his disciples tried to stop him.
Yeah, and they did. They tried to stop him, but Jesus welcomed them. He served children. He served the adults. And with Jairus and raising his daughter from the dead, Jairus, what was his occupation, if you will? What did he do? He was a synagogue ruler. You know, again, he might have been one of the house. He may have had some wealth and he may have had some power. But even wealthy, powerful people can be downtrodden at times. And that's what we find with Jairus, with the sickness and the subsequent death of his daughter. And Jesus did raise her back to life again and help his spirit.
Blind man on the side of the road that everybody pushed aside.
Yep. There's many, many examples.
Not even doing for people, just talking, the Samaritan woman,
Oh, yes.
making people recognize their worth.
Yep. Some people you just tend to just overlook them and just pretend that they're not there. You stare straight ahead and just ignore as you walk by. That's correct. And so what are some of the ways we can help the poor, the sick, and downtrodden today? What can we do? Oh, the diapers for the people that's in the bulletin? Yes. And then you get the jail ministry that's going on, another segment that's typically forgotten.
Jesus is teaching, Matthew 25. For I was hungry, you gave me food, thirsty, you gave me drink, stranger, you took me in, naked, you clothed me, sick, you visited, prison, you came to me.
Yes, all those things. You know, some of the things that we can do here at Walter Hill, you know, I'd encourage you to take a look at the emails and texts that come out from the care groups. That's one way we can serve. Our food pantry that Ed heads up, you know, people are hungry, they need food, and we've been able to help several people, and Ed does a great job with that. You're on a visitation team going out and visiting folks that come here. Calls, cards of encouragement, all those things. If you've been a recipient of a card or recipient of a call, you appreciate those things. And so Acts 10:38 records, and God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. And what a wonderful way to describe a person. He went about doing good. And I would hope that could be said of us here at Walter Hill, that we went about doing good. And the next segment we'll talk about is disciples. And there are a couple stories where Jesus served his disciples. Which story might come to your mind maybe first? Washing the feet. That's the one that came to my mind first. And that was the events of the Last Supper. It's getting closer to the time when Jesus was going to be crucified, and he and his disciples had been traveling towards Jerusalem. They had gathered in the upper room, and it was time to eat. And Judah is generally a dry and dusty city. I know some of us had the privilege of getting to go to Israel a few years ago while they were sort of playing nice. And but the disciples' feet would have been dirty from walking. They didn't have Skechers, you know. They didn't have Nikes or whatever you happen to be wearing. And they didn't have carpet, so Anyway, their feet were dirty. But let's pick up at John 13, verses 3 through 5. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. These disciples had asked Jesus for positions of authority earlier. They wanted to sit at his right hand and left hand. They were all clamoring to be chief. And Jesus had told them that the greatest should be the servant of all. None of Jesus' disciples made the move to wash the feet of Jesus or to wash the feet of their fellow disciples. And it's evident that James and John, who wanted to sit at the right and left side of Jesus, did not get the message taken to heart. Jesus set the example by washing and cleaning the feet of the disciples, one of whom would soon deny him, and another one who would soon betray him. One more example to consider is that of John 21, 9 through 13. It's another fish story for Matt and for Timmy. And shortly before Jesus would return to his Father in heaven, Jesus took one more opportunity to serve his disciples. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. Here towards the end, before Jesus was going to be resurrected back into heaven, ascended back into heaven, he was here serving as a cook and as a waiter with his disciples, feeding them. Okay, the last section I'll go to before I turn it over to Dan is Jesus' service for all mankind. Jesus became a servant to those he interacted with during his short stay on earth, but his service to humanity did not cease when he ascended into heaven. I want to return to Matthew 10:45 that we read earlier. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to give his life as a ransom for many. One of the ways, and the most important way, that Jesus served was to lay down his life for all mankind, from the first man Adam to the ones he walked among in the first century, to us today, and for those that will be born into the future. He's still serving them by providing them with the sacrifice as a way to be forgiven of their sins. In another passage, Paul described Jesus in this way in Philippians 2, verses 5 through 7. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Here Paul describes Jesus as willingly emptying himself and becoming a servant from all of mankind. One might say, well, that's good, but what am I to do? Well, in the two verses prior to that, in Philippians 2, 3, and 4, Paul instructs us on what we can do as followers of Jesus Christ. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look upon not only to his own interest, but to the interest of others. Jesus was the ultimate servant. He took on tasks that were not befitting of the creator of the universe. It's not befitting Jesus to wash the feet of his disciples, but he did it to set an example. This is how we should be. You know, we could lay down our lives. I don't think any of us have been asked to do that. But we could be asked to lay down our lives, and we could do that. But we can never provide the salvation that comes from Jesus. So what can we do? Well, I suggest we just look around and find things for our hands and our minds and our bodies to do. If we want to serve, there's ample ways for us to do that. All right, that's the end of my segment. Dan, come up here, take it over.
Let me get this hooked on. Here's a familiar verse from John, 1 John 4:19. We love him because he first loved us. There's no way we could cover in about 20 minutes all that Jesus did, and there's no way we can cover everything that John did. And in all of our classes this quarter, it has not been our effort for everything, but to see what we can learn from the lives of the people we're discussing. Some things we know about John. He was very close, had a close personal relationship with our Lord. This slide, or this message from this passage, is typical of John. He recognized, maybe not fully early on, but by the end of his lengthy life, he emphasized in so much of his writings the importance of love. The love that he saw in what Jesus did for mankind. John wanted to share that. He wanted to make sure we understood that. He was one of the Lord's closest friends and companions, but his life was transformed from what it was at the beginning until the end. When we first meet John in Scripture, he was not described as gentle or loving. In fact, he was one of the sons of thunder. You may recall that reference in Mark chapter 3, verse 17. Along with his brother James, they were referred to as the sons of thunder. In Luke chapter 9, after Jesus was rejected by a Samaritan village, you read, "And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did?'" Have you ever wanted to do that to somebody? Maybe just when you drove around town and some people do some just terrible things in traffic, and maybe you've had the tendency to that would be kind of maybe tempting to do that. Quick side note, has nothing to do with this other than how you might get upset in those situations. I think it might be interesting to try this approach. If we could equip our vehicles like James Bond's vehicles and have paintball equipment on the front that you could just tag people that do that to you. You'd have to be careful, though, who had access to those, or everybody would be getting splashed all the time. Well, that's a side note. Not that important anyway. So John was known as a son of thunder. Apparently, he had a temper, and he had just a get-even mentality. As Randall has already mentioned, in James and John asking for a prominent place in the Lord's kingdom, there's evidence of their ambition, and dare I say even how presumptuous it would be. Jesus taught on another occasion about the importance of not choosing to sit up at the front, but to sit in the back, and it's better to be asked to move forward instead of being humiliated by being told to move back. Well, James and John kind of wanted to be up front, didn't they? That's what they desired. In Matthew 20, verse 20 through 28, you can see a discussion of that, as well as the passage that Randall read a moment ago. And the other disciples were angry about this. But just think how presumptuous that would be. Over time, though, with some rebukes from the Lord, some correction, some teaching, and examples that the Lord provided, like washing the disciples' feet, John was transformed by Jesus and by his teaching. His thundering temperament was transformed into tenderness and love. He was a close companion, as was mentioned. Randall and I did not compare notes on this, but look how many times we were discussing some of the same things. But raising of Jairus' daughter, only 3 disciples, 3 of the apostles, were present to witness that: James, John, and Peter. At the Transfiguration in Matthew chapter 17, we read, as well as other places, but who were the 3 with them? James, John, and Peter. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus went further into the garden, he took James, John, and Peter. So John was really close personally to the Lord, more so than most of the other followers. Perhaps another bit of evidence of the closeness is John himself referring in Scripture, in the Gospel of John, according to John, he's referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, that's a little bit interesting. If he, at one point in his life, kind of wanted to be out front, but then when he writes, he doesn't use his name. He learned something about humility, apparently. In John 13:23 and also in 21:20, we see recorded about him being the disciple that was leaning on the breast of Jesus. I have a hard time figuring out just how they ate, because I'm so used to, in our culture, to sitting at a table, having our feet under the table and sitting in a chair. But the idea, I'm sure you've had that explained to you or read about them reclining, and so one person's head would be close to another person's chest or whatever. Seems like you'd drop food all over each other. But John is described as being there with his head on Jesus' chest or breast. And at the crucifixion, who was entrusted to care for the Lord's mother? But the Apostle John. In John 19, verse 26 and 27, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." From that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. Again, I think that's evidence of their closeness, their close connection. And then John was the only one that was a close witness at the mock trials, if you will, before the high priest. We read about in John chapter 18. And it was John's influence, no doubt, that gave him access to that, but also got Peter a little bit closer to witness some of that. So John was close to the Lord. He learned a lot from the Lord. And by the end of his life, he didn't portray himself as someone who was presumptuous, as someone who was overly ambitious to build himself up, as someone who was ready to strike down fire on people that rejected him. John talked about love just, well, more than you can even comprehend really fully. The depth of the Lord's love. Have you ever tried to wrap your mind around that? How much love the Lord has for us? And John was a firsthand or eyewitness. And in his letters, he emphasizes that he was a witness. If you were not in a couple of classes recently, you missed out. It was not too many months ago that Kenneth led a class in this auditorium when we were facing the other way on the 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And I think it was the next quarter or maybe 2 quarters after that, Bob Tracy and Josh Terrell taught the same subject on a class with the young families down the hall. And both classes were very helpful in trying to comprehend the message of love that John was trying to get across, and many other things as well. By the end of his life, John was known for his constant exhortation to love one another. His writings in the gospel and the epistles of John overflow with that theme of love, sacrificial, faithful love that mirrors Christ himself. So let's take a look at some of those. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but just a few. In John chapter 3, first from the gospel according to John, John chapter 3:16, I suspect you could quote that without having to turn to it, couldn't you? Demonstrating God's love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have life. If you need the Lord's Supper tonight, that's prepared in a room down the hallway to your left. I believe that's still the case. And when I was trying to quote that by not looking at it, you realize I went to the old King James instead of what's on the slide, I think is the New King James. You ever do that when you quote something from memory? You got the way you learned it first. Secondly, in John chapter 13:34, Jesus said, John recorded, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." And that's right after this illustration of Jesus washing the disciples' feet that Randall mentioned, that John 13:34 reference. Jesus told them, I'm leaving this for you as an example. You go do likewise. You be like this. And then John 13:35, the very next verse, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Have you ever been a witness to a pretty vocal argument between a few people? You don't have to raise your hand and say who it was, but I suspect you've all seen that. I don't know about you, but when I am around something like that, I kind of want to fade into the background and get away from it. Are you that way? I don't really like to tangle with that kind of stuff. Don't really like to be involved with that kind of stuff. I find it much more appealing to be around people that get along with one another, people that love one another. I wonder if that's something to do with the message here. Why would the world want what we have if they look at us and see us bickering and arguing and tearing each other up all the time? They wouldn't. But if they see in the body of Christ people who love each other, people who work together well, people who support one another, who encourage one another, who help when one is down, others help pick them up. If people would witness that, don't you just imagine they'd be wondering, what's this all about? I want to be around that. I want to see that. I want to be a part of that. I need that. There's so much division in the religious world today. If we would master this as the church as a whole, wouldn't that make a difference? Let the world know. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. I think then we would not have the divisions that we had, that exist so much in the religious world. Relates to the unity emphasized in 1 Corinthians, for example, and in Jesus' prayer in John 17. Okay, continuing on, another few in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 12. My command is this, Jesus says, love each other as I have loved you. Now, that's a tall order. That doesn't mean just grin and bear it or grit your teeth. I had the privilege of being a father of 2 children. Now, if you just have one, you haven't had the privilege of making children that disagree with each other get along. But if you have 2 or more, you've been a part of that, haven't you? They don't always get along. And oh, how much fun it is when they're having these problems as little children. Not now. You know these girls, so I've got to be careful, don't I? But as little children, and they might not get along, and, well, you need to love each other. You do love each other. So do things like, say you're sorry. Well, I'm sorry. Well, that's really convincing. I can't begin to tell you how many times we had to have a discussion as the girls were growing up. Well, what does it mean to be sorry? How do you demonstrate that you really are sorry? And it's more than just saying sorry. It's just much deeper than that. My command is this, Jesus says, love each other as I have loved you. That's a deep love that must be genuine, must be from the heart and the mind, and not because you're forced to do it, because you want to do it, because of that relationship. John 15:13, Jesus demonstrates or describes that love. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus did that very thing, as Randall has alluded to or referred to a moment ago. And in John 15:17, this is my command, love each other. Well, if that's what Jesus commands us to do, and John is reminding us repeatedly through the gospel according to John, well, we ought to do that, hadn't we? John didn't leave that message alone when he wrote the letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So in 1 John chapter 3, for this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Well, we heard it just a little bit ago, didn't we? Jesus taught it, including teaching it to John. And John is reminding his readers in 1 John, this is what we've known from the beginning. Love one another. 1 John 3:18, dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. It's easy to say, I love you. It's a little harder to actually show I love you by actions. We need to do both, don't we? It's nice to hear I love you. And maybe you've heard this little illustration where a husband and wife were having a little bit of a disagreement on something, and she was kind of pouting a little bit, and she said, I just don't know that you love me. And he said, well, I told you that when we got married. You probably said something like that yesterday, didn't you? I told you that when we got married, and if I change my mind, I'll let you know. Well, that's not good enough. We need to show and say and communicate, I love you, and amongst each other. If we are to love one another, we need to show it, not just say it.
And things that you're bringing with you that you have to learn differently.
Right.
I think that we have to consider that love is kindness and compassion and teaching and training without judgment.
Good.
Because I think that's what's missing in the church today, is that we expect people to fix it before they come to church.
Yeah.
And the church is where we all need helping.
Exactly. Yeah, excellent point. Excuse me. Let's see, that was the last one on that? Yes. And I think 2 more, maybe 3 more. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Same chapter. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Same chapter. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Well, there can be no doubt that John could accurately be described as the apostle of love. He lived and demonstrated a lifetime of service by loving and teaching us to love one another genuinely in action, not just in words. He was also the author of what book? Revelation, the vision of Christ's ultimate victory, written near the end of the first century when he would have been a very aged man. He reminds us even there that love and hope are inseparable. When we live in the love of Christ, we see beyond the trials, the problems we face now, to eternal triumph, looking ahead to that. So how about an application as we close? Are you answer this to yourself, you don't have to tell me. Are you more likely, like the early son of thunder, passionate, quick to speak, quick to judge? Or are you more like the later life of the Apostle John, learning to live as the apostle of love, gentle, kind, patient, steadfast? May we challenge ourselves to love as Christ loved, offering forgiveness, kindness, and humility to one another through love. We can impact the world. By this, the world will know that you are my disciples, Jesus said, and John shared. God bless you. Thank you much. Next week, I think, Randall, you have Paul. So read all about the Apostle Paul, and then we'll have just one more after that, I think. Thank you very much.